Hi, everyone. So let's travel back in time for a moment to 1897. A sociologist, Émile Durkheim, comes out with this truly radical idea. He claimed that suicide, this deeply personal and tragic act, isn't just about what's going on inside someone's head. Nope. He argued it's actually a social phenomenon, driven by forces in society itself. It was an idea that completely changed the game for sociology, so let's really dive into it.
You know, we're all taught to see suicide as this terrible individual struggle, and it is. But Durkheim asks us to just zoom out for a second and think about a really challenging question. What if society itself plays a huge part? What if suicide rates are actually a kind of vital sign, telling us about the health of our communities? That's the core idea we're going to be digging into today.
Now, to get what he's arguing, you've got to understand his key concept, the social fact. Okay, so what is that? Think of it like a powerful, invisible force, kind of like social gravity. Things like social pressure or cultural norms that shape our actions, often without us even realizing it. Durkheim saw suicide rates not as millions of separate tragic stories, but as one single social fact, a measurable pattern that could show us the hidden forces shaping a society.
So you might be wondering, why this topic? Why focus on something so sensitive? Well, for Durkheim, it was personal. He had actually lost a close friend to suicide, but his goal was much, much bigger. He wanted to prove that our most private struggles are often linked to much larger public issues. By studying these patterns in suicide, he was trying to carve out a space for sociology as its own science, to show that society has this powerful influence totally separate from individual psychology.
So what did he find when he crunched the numbers? He discovered these really consistent and frankly baffling patterns all across Europe. He saw that suicide rates were higher for Protestants than for Catholics. They were higher for single people than for married folks, and higher for men than for women. And get this is the real shocker. Rates were actually higher during peacetime than they were during war. Now, these couldn't just be random coincidences, right? Durkheim knew he was onto something, that these were clues pointing to a much larger social cause.
And all these patterns led him to his central theory. He argued that our risk of suicide is shaped by two key social forces. The first one is social integration, basically how connected we feel to our community. And the second is social regulation, how much our lives are structured by society's rules and norms. He said it's the balance, or, the imbalance, between these two forces that creates his four distinct types of suicide.
All right, first up is what he called egoistic suicide. This is the one that happens when our social integration, our connection to others, is just too weak. It really comes from this deep feeling of not belonging, of being cut off from the group.
So, when we have too much individualism, it can weaken our bonds to family, to friends, to our whole society. And when that happens, people are left feeling totally isolated, with the sense that their life has no real meaning beyond themselves. A perfect example of this is maybe an elderly person who has lost their spouse and friends. That whole social network is gone. Or think about someone who moves to a giant anonymous city and just feels completely and utterly alone. That deep lack of connection, that is the heart of egoistic suicide. Now, on the complete flip side, you have altruistic suicide. And as you can probably guess, this happens when social integration is too strong. This is where a person is so completely absorbed into a group that their own individual life starts to seem less important than the group's mission. In this situation, the person feels this powerful, almost sacred duty to sacrifice themselves for the good of the collective, because their own identity has basically just merged with the group's. The classic example here is a soldier who jumps on a grenade to save their unit. Or, on a darker note, members of a religious cult who take their own lives because their leader commands it. In these extreme cases, the demands of the group just completely overwhelm the individual's basic instinct to survive. Okay, our third type is anomic suicide. And here, we're shifting our focus from integration to that other force, regulation. This type is caused by too little social regulation, a state that Durkheim famously called anomie. Anomie is basically normlessness. It's what happens when society's rules and expectations just break down, usually during some kind of rapid change like an economic boom or bust. When the old rules just don't apply anymore, people are left feeling confused, lost, and totally adrift. Just imagine someone who built a successful business, and then, boom, a sudden market crash wipes them out overnight.
Everything that gave their life structure and meaning is just gone. This dizzying feeling of normallessness, of being untethered from society, can lead to incredible despair.
And finally, the opposite of anomic is fatalistic suicide. This one results from way too much regulation. It happens in these incredibly oppressive situations where a person's life is so tightly controlled that their future just feels completely hopeless and inescapable.
When you're living under that kind of extreme repression with absolutely no personal freedom, suicide can start to feel like the only way out. Durkheim gave some pretty stark examples for this one, like an enslaved person or a prisoner who's serving a life sentence under a really brutal regime. When someone is living with zero hope and is totally oppressed, they might see death as their only real escape. That right there is the core of fatalistic suicide. So that's the theory. It's from the late 1800s. You might be thinking, why are we still talking about this? Well, it's because Durkheim's whole framework, this idea of balancing our connection to others and the rules we live by, is still incredibly relevant today. In fact, it actively shapes how we approach public health.
You can seriously see Durkheim's influence everywhere. When you see public health programs creating social networks for the elderly, what are they fighting? Egoistic suicide. When schools work hard to create a strong sense of community and belonging, they're boosting integration. And policies that promote work-life balance or provide a social safety net during a recession, they're trying to prevent anomic suicide. His framework is, without a doubt, fundamental to how we think about prevention today.
But of course, no theory this huge and influential goes unchallenged. To really get the full picture, we have to take a look at the criticisms and where people say Durkheim might have missed the mark. Okay, so the biggest critique, the one you hear most often, is that in his mission to prove the power of society, Durkheim pretty much ignored the individual. Thinkers like Max Weber and Sigmund Freud came back and said, whoa, hold on a minute. You can't possibly understand suicide by only looking at group statistics. They argued you have to consider a person's unique feelings, their mental health, their inner world. And the criticisms don't stop there. People have pointed out that the data he used back then was pretty flawed, since suicide was often covered up. He's also been accused of something called the ecological fallacy, which basically means just because a group has a high suicide rate, you can't assume every single person in that group feels that way. Plus, let's be honest, reality is messy. His 4 neat boxes are probably too simple, and his whole model was based on 19th century Europe, so how well does it really fit other cultures? But even with all these valid points, Durkheim's legacy is just immense. He fundamentally changed how we see ourselves. He forced us to look up and recognize this deep, undeniable connection between our private well-being and the health of our entire society. He gave us a new language and a new lens to see how these massive social forces can reach into the most personal corners of our lives. So I'll leave you with this to think about. In a world that puts so much emphasis on individualism, how much of who we are and the choices we make are really just a reflection of the social currents that are all around us? It's a big question. Thank you.